Welcome to session number 11 and the last one of the 2016 Virtual Genealogy Fair. Our final lecture, we offer Faces of the National Park Service by Cara Moore. During this session, she will spotlight some of the leaders of the National Park Service using official personnel folders of the Department of the Interior. Ms. Moore is a reference archivist for research services with the National Archives at St. Louis. I am now turning the broadcast over to Cara Moore.
Hi, I'm Cara, and I'm going to talk about the Faces of the National Park Service today. I'm going to take a look at some of the earliest National Park Service employees using official personnel folders that are found at the National Archives in St. Louis in honor of the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service. All of the images are from the official personnel folders from the Department of the Interior, National Park Service, of Record Group 146, records of the U.S. Civil Service Commission, National Archives in St. Louis, Missouri. As I get started, I want to make a note that there were several small typos that were not caught until after my presentation was sent to the printers for handouts and live feed streaming. This includes some language. It's the National Park Service, not the National Parks, plural. And then there were some dates that needed to be changed. You'll notice that some of the dates of service begin before 1916. That's just because these individuals had service with the Department of the Interior before the National Park Service was actually formed, so don't get confused by that. My very first person is Mr. Stephen Mather. His dates of service range from 1915 to 1929. By September of 1915, he was appointed as an assistant to the director of the Department of the Interior to do work related to the national parks. He was tasked specifically to straighten out Yosemite. He started this task by taking a tour of several national parks over the summer of 1915, continued into the fall. Since there was no real precedent for this kind of work that Mather was working on, he himself was able to set his per diem at $4 a day, which covered all of his expenses while surveying the current state of the national parks. This survey and his personal interest combined to give him the necessary knowledge to introduce new plans and ideas to share the national parks more widely with the public and to raise awareness for the national parks themselves to try to really drive in some tourism. And also, since his personal interest as a naturalist existed, he was able to really help with some of the conservation as well. August 29, 1916, Mather's work helped to secure the passage of the National Park Service Bill. The bill had been pending in Congress for several years while Mather was serving as an assistant director to the Department of the Interior. So his survey was able to give some hard evidence to really secure the need for this bill and push it through Congress. Mather was renowned for his knowledge of wildlife and natural preservation, as well as how to drive tourism and how tourism works as far as building public interest and well-being. In April of 1917, he was appointed as the first director of the new National Park Service. So there's a little bit of a time gap between these. There was no formal director during this time, but while they were creating what was going to qualify as a director and what was going to be required from him. His charismatic personality allowed him to make some lasting connections that were kept across all of the national parks. This level of really camaraderie that he built up when he was doing these surveys carries over into his official appointment as a director. He established some previously non-existent positions, including his own, and upheld a really high standard for that post and for the national parks. His genuine affection is reflected in a lot of different letters that were written both to the president and to the director of the Department of the Interior. And all these letters are in his OPF. They're really interesting to read and to see his language and see his real big drive to stay in the National Park Service and to keep the National Park Service in the public interest. There were many appeals and endorsements that were written in, again, both to the director and directly to the president on Mather's behalf. In 1921, this is when his renewal for appointment came up, and some of the language discussed in these letters came from both professionals and from the general public, just tourists who went to the park and happened to meet him. They referred to Mather as absolutely unique in his abilities and the decentest Democrat, and I want to point out that that's a lowercase d on the Democrat. He attended various conferences on state parks on behalf of the National Park Service, and he even visited the Canadian national parks for study. So he's really broadening what it means to be a national park in the United States at this time, and he's got some transnational information going on as he's flowing from Canada to see how their national parks are maintained to really make sure that our park service is one of the best. He spoke at the Field Museum in Chicago and at numerous universities during his employment. These talks really helped to drive attendance at the national parks. Nationwide, the parks saw attendance grow from 356,097 to 1,058,455. These numbers were accumulated by the Geysers to Glaciers Association of Montana, and these numbers are put into his OPF as justification for some of his efficiency ratings. He made several personal monetary contributions to the projects that enhanced the parks. By January of 1929, however, he was not feeling too well in the day-to-day, wasn't able to uphold his duties with the vigor that he had as a youth. He resigned due to this declining health and then passed away a year later almost exactly. While he was serving, he created 7 new parks, and at the time of his resignation, there were 2 that were still pending and getting pushed through and getting open to the public. The next person I'm going to talk about is Horace M. Albright. His dates of service range from 1913 to 1933. Again, we see an early date of service. He was hired in as a confidential clerk to the Secretary of the Interior in June of 1913. He was hired in with some pretty significant previous experience. He was a forest guide, he was a lumberman, he was a miner. He taught as he was going through college and after college, and he had a law degree and operated as a lawyer. By April 1915, he's working with Mather on projects related to the National Park Service. So it's still pre-National Park Service, but Mather and Albright are kind of brainstorming together, working side by side, getting through these national parks. By May of 1916, he was actually moved to be the assistant attorney for the Department of the Interior. Because of his legal experience, he was able to handle some of the legal matters that included the care of wild game in Yosemite. So he is applying both natural knowledge and legal knowledge, still in the interest of the national parks of the United States. By May of 1917, he was the first appointed assistant to the director of the National Park Service. At this time, the director is Mather, who he has a long-standing relationship with. Albright's duties as an assistant to the director directly engages his legal knowledge. He also covers for Mather as he has some bouts of illness throughout his tenure. In June of 1919, Albright moved in position to serve as a superintendent to the Yellowstone National Park. So he's the head over the entire Yellowstone National Park. He In 1920, adds to his duties by additionally being a field assistant to the director. This doesn't have a full title change. It's added to his regular duties. There's not any pay raise or anything like that, but it's definitely added to his docket. These duties have Albright going from various conferences of the superintendents of the various national parks. They have conversations about what's going on in the National Park Service, what they need, how they're going to get the word out a little bit more and drive tourism. He also hosts congressmen directly on tours of the parks. This really builds that relationship between Congress and the National Park System, National Park Service, so that as the National Park Service needs maybe a bigger budget or needs to approve a new national park into the system, there are congressmen who have this relationship and who have this newfound love for the National Park Service, and to visit the national parks, they see the importance there. There's a real personal relationship that's created because of Albright's outreach. We know all of this really detailed information because there are itineraries that are included in his official personnel folder. These cover from day-to-day duties, like an approximation of what he's going to do in a week, what he's going to do over a month. There's even detailed down to hour-by-hour plans and meetings. It doesn't cover the entirety of his service. That's a lot of paperwork. But there is a significant amount so that you get a really clear picture of what Albright's days look like, what Albright's years look like, what his projection is throughout his service. This creates an increased demand, an extension of services, so ultimately they have to create a new position for what Albright is doing. In August of 1926, Albright becomes the first assistant director specifically for the field. Now, looks really similar to what that last position he was in was, but it is a new position, a little bit different language, enough to make it a new position. He is in this position tasked specifically with the inspection of the parks and the monuments, their operations and their employees, so how everything is handled on a little bit lower level rather than a huge oversee. He did oversee, however, the addition of the Sequoia National Park while in this position. In January of 1929, he became the acting director in Mather's illness. There were a ton of employees who wrote in during this time, and they are really exclaiming their loyalty. They're talking about how much they want to stay underneath Albright's leadership, how great and how knowledgeable these people are. And then just a few short days later, he gets fully appointed to be the director of the National Park Service. At this time of appointment, he is serving with the National Park Service, which is second only to the Bureau of Indian Affairs in terms of size and importance under the Department of the Interior. So the National Park Service has seen huge growth in this amount of time. In 1933, he attends as a representative of the National Park Service and contributes to the organization, personnel, and project choices to the founding of the Civilian Conservation Corps. So it's important to know that there is a relationship between the CCC and the Department of the Interior as far as project choice, like I said, the different kind of people beyond the enrollees who were involved with the CCC. In July of 1933, he resigns officially, but he does get asked back intermittently as a collaborator all the way from 1935 until 1973. So for a long time, he's a big consultant and still has a say in what's going on and gives his kind of 2 cents to what happened around the National Park Service. The next person I'm going to talk about is one of my favorites. He is Frank Pinkley, often referred to as Boss. His dates of service range from 1901 to 1940, again, a very, very early beginning date with the Department of the Interior. In December of 1901, he's the only applicant who applies to take over the custodianship of the Casa Grande ruins when the previous custodian resigned. The previous custodian was a leader of a nearby congregation whose service was really just a matter of convenience because of his proximity. And when he eventually is like, I'm not going to come here anymore, it's out of my way now, he actually resigned from his congregation at the same time, so it's no longer convenient. Mr. Pinkley is the only person who knows about this area, and he has a huge base of knowledge, and he applies and petitions his position unknowingly to him against nobody. But he sends in with his application these great letters of endorsement. So his official personnel file was really a treat for me to see so many letters from his community really backing him as a person and a reliable person to be involved with the National Park Service, which at this time is not the National Park Service, but is actually overseen by the General Land Office. They were in charge of several of the ruins that eventually become the National Park Service. During a 3-month absence in 1906 due to some family matters, Pinkley's father, Sam, actually steps in to take over the custodianship for the Casa Grande. So you see there's really a lifelong passion that's been passed down through his family. Between 1901 and 1913, the Casa Grande ruins saw a bunch of improvements, and this is stuff that Boss accomplished by himself. He dug a well, he erected buildings, sheds, corrals. This includes an actual homestead that didn't exist before, both for himself and with the knowledge that future custodians would be needing a place to live and have a place to stay. So he builds this really with a huge amount of foresight. All these things were done at his own expense. He himself built most of it just to improve it and really make it inhabitable. Previously, there is no neighbor, so no other homestead at all, or water anywhere for 3 to 4 miles. So that really brings into focus how the previous custodian was living and how his matter of convenience was important to anything associated with the Casa Grande ruins. And it goes to show you maybe why he was the only other applicant. While he worked, he did work with the General Land Office to have some building plans. He submitted all of these plans and worked with the Department of the Interior for this. There was an original building plan to have 5 different rooms. He increases that to 105 and really makes it a hospitable area. He kept up with his paperwork and reports of the land, how many visitors were coming through, and isn't just like a handyman who is security for the area, but makes a lot of significant improvements and has the numbers to back it up. He worked directly with the Smithsonian to uncover more ruins on site, so he grows the physical area as well. In 1914, there was a brief resignation while he went to run for the House of Representatives in Arizona. His wife, Edna, or E.T., steps in as a custodian, and that's what this letter is showing. It's Frank suggesting that his wife would be a suitable replacement in his absence. This kind of goes back and forth for a little while. It's all documented in his OPF, but eventually they do just appoint his wife to cover for him for a couple months while he's out campaigning, and she does a great job. So really, really a family-oriented kind of passion. In January of 1918, he does come back. He reapplies. He is accepted at this point as a National Park Service employee. So the National Park Service has been created, no longer has to deal with the General Land Office, and is working on with the National Park Service. He takes a while to come back in because he has some salary negotiations between himself and Mather. These negotiations aren't just based on salary, though. It's also based on Frank's vision for the Casa Grande area. There's different development plans, road plans to and from, publicity campaigns, different public bulletins that are included as part of these publicity campaigns. So he knows that he wants to come back and is doing everything he can to showcase his ability. In December of 1918, so not quite a year after he comes back, he takes on additional duties at Tumacacori National Monument in Arizona. In May of 1919, it's described in a page of his OPF that he is the one man in the National Park Service that we can depend on for archaeological and historical work by Albright. So really speaking up his general knowledge of Park Service and conservation in general, not just in this area, but as a whole. He's very delicately referred to as Pink when this conversation is going on. I just think that's hilarious. He's got so many fun nicknames. Montezuma Castle National Park gets added to his list of demands. He is referred to as an expert on early missionary history. So again, his knowledge just goes really, really deep. The person who called him that is the acting director at this time, who is speaking on his behalf. In September of 1922, he gets sent to Yosemite Conference on behalf of the National Park Service because of these big, vast areas of expertise. In April of 1928, he gets promoted to the title of superintendent. Up until this point, he's still serving as a custodian, definitely in a lower pay, and obviously with a huge amount on his plate. So he's superintendent of the Southwest Monuments. So this includes everything in New Mexico, everything in Arizona, everything in Colorado, everything in Utah, except for just 3 monuments. So in 1932, this is 18 different areas. In 1934, it has grown to 25, and by 1939, it's 26 different areas that he is in charge of. This includes 3 different civilian conservation corps camps. So in total, there's about 600 people who are employed in all of these areas. Now, though he's not directly in charge of some of those people, he's in charge of the people who are in charge of them in one way or another. And just as a side note, we do have the CCC records here, so if that sparks your interest, definitely write in for those. He died while in office in February of 1940. There's a monument to him at the Salinas Pueblo Missions. So, again, one of my favorite people. He really just did so much and had such a passion there, and his OPF details it beautifully. The next person I'm going to talk about is Gertrude S. Cooper. Her dates of service are from 1940 until 1945. July of 1940, she gets appointed to be the superintendent of the Vanderbilt Mansion National Historic Site. This is the first time that this historic site has a superintendent, so not only is she a prominent woman, but she is the first to be in this area at all, regardless of gender. She works with the War Department to keep the Civilian Conservation Corps camp that was on site running well and operating within the Historic Sites mission as well as the CCC's mission. In 1941, she oversees the change of the old pavilion to be an inn. So now it's open to the public, people can come in. She personally sent a ton of social invites to come and visit, and those letters and the responses are all kept in her OPF, so it's really neat to see just the different social people that she's rubbing shoulders with. She got asked to be a part of the Women's Uniform Committee. This committee addresses maybe some more practical uniform choices for women who are working with the National Park Service. As women slowly get more and more inclusion, they find out that they really need some different dress wear, and she is seen as a trustworthy and level-headed woman who should be part of this committee. She personally called for the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, to participate in the upkeep of these areas. So she knows that the Works Progress Administration and really a lot of other New Deal programs exist and are already getting funding to do a lot of the upkeep for the United States. Really across the nation, they're doing different upkeep projects, so she has the idea to utilize them. So it's not only creating jobs through the WPA, but it's cutting down on the NPS budget and utilizing funds that are already available in other areas. She has this really strong knowledge of knowing what's going on with these other government projects that are, like I said, already intended for national improvement. She has a knowledge of restoration in a general way, and this allows her to have some proactive outreach and anticipation of possible budget pushbacks. She sees if something's going to need some conservation in the future, she has contacts already, and she's able to reach out to them and say, like, hey, the tennis court on its site could really be used by some of the Army boys who are nearby. I know somebody who does this restoration. It would bring a lot of value to the site and to our tourism. So her knowledge and capability is just outstanding for the position that she's in. She uses the networking to drive tourism. Like I said, lots of social invites to different big names in society at this time. She also creates an expanded accessibility to Vanderbilt through utilizing the existing programs. This includes down to like road building, which if anybody knows about the history of the WPA and the history of the CCC, they had a lot to do with literally building roads across the United States. And she knows that sometimes people aren't getting out to these national parks and these historic sites simply because they aren't accessible. So she utilizes that kind of knowledge and the available resources to drive up that accessibility so people don't have those excuses anymore. In 1943, the National Park Service is attempting to move her from being a superintendent to a custodian. This is a demotion both in title and in pay as they're kind of starting to cut back and figure out what's going on. The New Deal system starting to filter out, but she is able to detail her full duties that are performed. She compares numbers provided for like superintendents in different areas, and she is able to show when she goes above and beyond what other people are doing and already getting paid less for it. So she ended up getting a raise, and she retained her title through these efforts and through her knowledge of what's going on. The next closest position to Miss Cooper is in the East Hemisphere, East area of the United States. They host about 7,000 tourists a year. Now, on the opening of Vanderbilt in 1941, they only expected about 3,000 visitors a month. 300. And she is able to drive this up to actually 5,612. So really blowing that number out of the water. She gets 20,000 total tourists a year. She gets adding concessions into the area so people have a reason to stick around. They don't need to leave when they're hungry for lunch. She also adds a greenhouse operation that didn't last very long, but it was a significant idea that did drive some people in. She consistently trained the people that are working with the CCC and the WPA to be guides for the area so that she doesn't have to drive up her employment numbers. She is expected to have 8 full-time employees with 20 to 25 generally under her as a superintendent. The actual total comes closer to 94 with CCC and WPA members included. So again, she is overseeing a lot of what's going on, and even if she's not their direct report, she is overseeing the people who are overseeing these people and has a lot on her plate. She resigns in May of 1945 and really has left a huge precedent for the people who fill her shoes after this. I'm going to kind of dwindle down and just throw in some mentionable people. Ansel Hall was hired as one of the very first graduates of the University in Forestry. This program is intended for direct career path into the National Park Service, and he has a really successful career, and a lot of it comes from this idea of higher education and incorporating that into his service with the national parks. Robert S. Yard is a geological survey director, so this kind of shows you a different level of research for conservation efforts of the National Park Service, just to show that it's not just rangers, it's not just supervisors. There's a lot of big efforts that are coming from the National Park Service, even at these early times. Dr. Adolph Murray was a biologist for the Civilian Conservation Corps. Again, this kind of showcases the range of professionals who participated in the CCC camps beyond just the enrollees that were part of the mission for the New Deal program and enrolled for the CCC. We have lots of CCC higher up records here, as well as having the CCC enrollee records, as I mentioned earlier. Claire M. Hodges is the first female ranger. She was appointed to Yosemite directly by Mather. She served from May of 1918 until September of 1918. She has a pretty small record. She was appointed as a temporary employee only to fill in while there were men at war, and so they kind of knew she wasn't going to be a permanent person, and she was serving as a temporary. But it's significant to see that Mather was progressive enough to include her. There are some pictures that survive of her in uniform serving as a ranger, which are pretty interesting. Unfortunately, they were not part of her official personnel folder. But I do have this nice little note that says, we would like to appoint Clark, who is not the correct person, and we have a name adjustment there written in. I imagine that Mr. Mather wasn't super used to writing in female names when talking about appointing rangers at this point. Isabel Story served from 1910 until 1962. She starts as just a copyist. She moves into being a clerk with the Geological Survey. By 1916, she's serving directly under Mather in the National Park Service. Then she moves into a position as an assistant editor for the National Park Service, so all of the bulletins and language that they put out. In 1930, she is a full editor for the National Park Service Division of Publications. In 1934, she's an editor-in-chief. She changes again to be a chief of information. In 1955, she retires, but then she comes back as a consultant in 1962, so kind of in the same way that Albright comes back and deals with and helps with the way that the National Park Service is operating. Isabel's story has a great growth that happens under the National Park Service, and starting from just being a copy person and then just a clerk under Mather, her ability to describe what is going on is really seen, and she's promoted because of it in a pretty significant way, especially for a woman in these times. You could say that her skill with the quill was undeniable. I'm a huge Hamilton fan, so that's a direct quote from Mr. Lin-Manuel Miranda. And then that's a letter over to the side where she actually wrote to Gertrude Cooper, who we talked about just a little bit ago, and they have a good standing relationship. So again, it just shows how great Gertrude Cooper was with her outreach, and Isabel Story is a recognized and respected individual who writes in and has a relationship with these prominent people in the Park Service. I want to mention that I know there's not a whole lot of diversity to my project, but it's a product of the time, so we know that there were Buffalo soldiers who served as some of the first Rangers, and they're an entirely black regiment. These positions were military, so they don't fall within my civilian official personnel folders. Charles Young was the first black supervisor in 1903 to Yosemite. Again, a military position. We don't have the National Park Service yet at this time. My resources really stopped me at 1952, so they are going to be a little bit limiting, and just wanted to make a note of that and let everybody know that that's kind of why I wanted to include more, but can't really. Some of the later records have been appraised to be permanent. They're just not released by the Office of Personnel Management to be accessioned into the National Archives at this time. That doesn't mean that they're not going to. So after that, there's some information about how to write in if you think that you have a National Park Service member that you would like to see their OPF for. We do have a way for you to contact for the non-archival request, which means their service ended after 1951. So that information is both there for you. And now we're going to open the floor up.
Thank you so much. This is Andrea, and I will ask your questions for you. We do have quite a few that came in. So starting with the first one, my grandfather worked as a summer hire at Glacier National Park, probably early 1920s. Will there be records of summer hires?
It's possible that there were. I can't say yes or no. It kind of depends on the extent of their service as well as if they were considered to be federal employees or not. So we only had the federal employee records. The national parks themselves may have more extensive records, but the fact that he was a summer hire doesn't limit it. Definitely write in, and we'll be happy to do a search and tell you where to go next if we don't have anything.
Very good, thank you. Next question, are personnel records available for the National Park Service and the Forest Service in the 1930s and 1940s?
Yes.
Okay, there you go.
Asked and answered.
Are there personnel records for the Civilian Conservation Corps? Where would they be located?
Those are at the National Archives in St. Louis. We have both the enrollee records, so the young men who were enrollees of the CCC, and some of the higher up people, so the leaders, like I mentioned before, biologists. We have all of those records here.
Thank you, Cara. And this is Andrea. I just wanted to add, for those of you that were not on the chat, you might have missed that the Civilian Conservation Corps was covered in a session during last year's Genealogy Fair, and you can still find that session video and material on the Genealogy Fair website for 2015. So that was session number 5 last year. So, Cara, back to you. Our next question. I think you covered this, but let's talk about it again. Have they ever had a woman or person of color be over the National Park Service?
I assume that means as a director of the National Park Service.
Yes,
there have been. It's just a lot later than my records cover. The first black director was in 97, I believe. 1997. His name's Robert Stanton, and there's been several women in office. Like I said, just much later than my records cover.
Thank you. If I wanted to write in for CCC records, what type of information would they need for me to get a CCC alumni's file?
If they're referring to an enrollee, there is a standard form, 14136, that is available at archives.gov. Fill that form out as completely as possible, and they will get that. When that form gets sent in to me, then I do a search for it. Minimally, just to list off some of it, We need the full name, middle name if they've got one. If they don't have one, let me know. Date of birth, area where they were born, parents' names, that stuff really helps because there were so many people that were involved with the CCC that we need as most biographic information as possible to make sure we have the right person for you.
Thank you. That helps. Question, did Gertrude Cooper resign because men were returning from the war, as many women stopped working once the war was over?
It's not named as that in her OPF. She resigned because it was a heavy-duty job, and she didn't exactly need the employment, so it wasn't like she was working for money at this point. It was just a labor-intensive job, and she actually moved on and worked in New York in a different area.
Thank you, Cara. It looks like that was our last question, so I appreciate your presentation. We're going to now switch over to Diane Dimkoff, and
Thank you very much.
And she'll introduce a special guest. Thank you.
Thanks.
I'd like to say thank you to every one of our presenters, as well as every one of you who logged in from home in your bunny slippers and jammies with your cats and your dogs. We can't do this without you, so thank you. This really does conclude our sessions for the 2016 Virtual Genealogy Fair. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been our pleasure. If you missed a lecture, the videos and handouts will remain available on the fair website. Thank you for making this a huge success. If you have lingering questions, or if there's something you heard yesterday and you're still not clear about, please come visit us in person, send us an email at inquire@nara.gov, and we will do our best to assist you. We'll now have closing remarks, and I'm very pleased to welcome to the stage the National Archives Acting Executive for Research Services, Ann Cummings. Ann.
Thank you, Diane. I too want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for your participation in the successful 4th Virtual Genealogy Fair. And it was a success. Some of our early numbers are we had almost 5,000 people participate over the 2 days. Yesterday, we had almost 3,800 participants, and each of the sessions averaged around 500 people. Today, each of the sessions averaged around 235 people, and the participation keeps spiking, so thank you. The papers presented over the past 2 days, as we can see from the participation, have provided new insights and paths for participants to follow for genealogical research in our collections. As with other fairs, I also believe that we will benefit from the information we received during the online discussions and will find the post-fair feedback from the presentations very useful to us. At this time, I would like to personally thank the staff and the presenters who are directly responsible for making this fair a success. These people include Andrea Matney and Kathy Loomy, for all their tireless support in getting the fair moving, getting the IT support and coordination done, and their continued work after the fair. Thank you very much. The video support for keeping us live, I'd like to thank Jamie Atkinson, Julie Reed, Jason Winston, and Alexis Van Dyke. Without you, this wouldn't have been possible. I'd like to thank our social media helpers. You've been helping us with our Twitter and Facebook feeds, and we also thank you for your pre-conference work to get this up and running. These include Mary King, Angela Tudeco, Kristen Albritton, and Hillary Parkinson. Also, a huge thank to the web staff. You kept everything running. Crystal Brooks and Glenn Carver, thank you for keeping the computers running for these 2 days. I'd also like to thank Nancy Suster in St. Louis. I know you were standing by to help us out in case we had any IT or other technical issues. Thank you very much. And then, of course, a huge thank you to all the speakers. Claire Kluskins, Lori Cox-Paul, Sarah Swanson, Kelly Osborne, Suzanne Isaac, Meredith Dovak, David Pfeiffer, Ryan Bass, Teresa Fitzgerald, Brian McGraw, my personal favorite, David Hardin, and Cara Moore. And then, of course, as always, a huge debt of gratitude we owe to Diane Dimkoff. Her tireless efforts over the last years in making this fair happen, without her, this would not occur. So please, send Diane a note of thank you and encouragement, because without her, this would not have been possible. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for your participation and your continued interest in the National Archives collections and in genealogy. Thank you.